Hello, everybody. Very glad to meet you all. And yeah, I'm very happy to be here. I think it's a great project to sort of demonstrate in these times how we can work together and specifically work together virtually and in Europe across borders. So I think that's great. And I'd like to use the time I have. It will be only 15 minutes to give you a short introduction on what I think is sort of the bigger context around the issue of the future of work. So I'll be speaking about what is this overall debate on the future of work and how, in some steps, some aspects, maybe just to leave with you at the beginning of the process, on how we can really utilize this moment of where it's possible to maybe even leapfrog new kind of work. So I'll be speaking about the long-term future, which is maybe a bit counterintuitive at the moment, as we are all trying to deal with the short term very much. But I think there's a good reason for it. And then I'll focus on sort of what does that mean today? So how can we and are we actually leapfrogging to remote work? And how could we make it work? And just give you some insights from studies on this, while Birgit later on from Bertelsmann Foundation and the Future Work team will speak in more detail about sort of this implementation sides. So before we go into this question of the future of work and what are sort of issues that have been in the debate before we entered into the current crisis situation, I have to say at least a word about the fact that we have indeed witnessed disruption before, and what is sort of maybe one or two critical aspects to think about. Some of you will have seen these notions in the media or social media in the last days. So there was disruption before. If you look back longer, of course, other areas around the Industrial Revolution and so on come to mind. But September 11th, Fukushima, the financial crisis, 2007 were examples where we have seen massive and global scale disruption. And for the current situation we are in, is actually a fact that this was on the radar somehow. So if you look at, for example, the World Risk Reports or a famous speech from Bill Gates in 2015 that is now sort of going around the world saying Bill Gates has actually made a prophecy around this. This was somehow on the radar as an example of what's called disruption or black swans or wildcards, or similar, if not exactly the same terms and concepts around this. So this kind of radical change that we are witnessing at the moment has been witnessed before. And the key thing sort of to learn from this, not to go into much detail around it now, is that we tend to think about the future and the long term along the lines of what we have experienced so far. So a quote I often use is from Henry Ford saying, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would not have said, I want a car, I want something radically new. They would have said, give me a faster horse. So we tend to think in these extrapolation lines, in the continuation of the present. And we are currently in a situation where we see and witness and are in the midst of this kind of discontinuity. And I think it's worthwhile to keep that sort of in mind when we also imagine solutions that a kind of disruptive leapfrogging in the positive sense here, maybe in the solution side, is also possible. And now to look at this, what I would call the global longer term context for this debate around the future of work. I use one study that we were part of. It was made by the Millennium Project, which is an international nonprofit, works with over 60 nodes globally who contribute on the debate and studies around global future issues. It also does something called this State of the Future report every 2 years now. And it did that study starting already a couple of years back when it thought that's sort of a topic that might change a lot. And we're only looking at maybe 10 years ahead usually, and decided to look at 2050. And I'd just like to highlight from the study, and to let you know, the whole study's in the content sharing area of Atulia already, so you can go in more detail if you want to know more. But I'd just like to highlight one aspect, that in these scenarios, there are three main scenarios that came out of the project. There's also a scenario that assumes very radical change around the future of work, here often driven by radical technological change, by what deep sort of was at the forefront of the discussion on the future of work for a long time until now, which was AI and automation and these kinds of things. And imagines that this changes radically in all scenarios, actually. But what the study did was on purpose and really with a lot of intent, try to focus on a positive vision of how that could develop. And that's sort of what you see here on the right-hand side in the blue upper scenario. And actually in all these scenarios, this aspect of a higher share of mobile, self-organized work, including working from home, plays a role. But in that positive scenario, it is focused very much around the needs of people and the needs of society. So people have, in this scenario, sort of a mix of jobs often. Some are only self-employed, a much higher share than today, actually. But some are doing a mix, so they are doing a classical employment option, maybe for parts of their time, half the time or so, but also doing some self-employed work. Lots are doing the self-organized work for the community, for trying to contribute to the community, sometimes globally, and organized a lot around platforms and virtual cooperation. And for this kind of changed sort of idea around how work might work until 2050 and how this would change the overall concept of how we understand work, what the study says, what's critical to make that possible in a positive way and not the disruptive sort of bleak scenarios that are also out there, of course, and also covered in the study, is that it means a very, very strong learning push, also in different ways of learning than those organized in the traditional institutions. It needs a focus on self-organization, what's called meta skills. And these meta skills are often what's associated usually with social skills or soft skills, which is, I think, a bit of a problematic word. So it means being able to cooperate with others beyond the traditional boundaries of institutions and organizations and what we think of the traditional workplace, sort of reaching out to others. That these are crucial, and also here, maybe just to quickly touch upon it, an element of global cooperation and solidarity. So there's elements of a basic income, of massive redistribution of access to resources, income and capital and so on in this scenario, but I won't go into detail. So for the future of work, what's sort of critical to take with you is these different areas and modes of working and learning, with a high focus on self-organization, which is a skill that's not taught so much at the moment in the traditional institutions, and the skills around reaching out and working with others who may come from a completely different context and culture than what you're at. So my thesis is that we are, in a way, at the moment, leapfrogging exactly to this kind of future. I've just brought one number from current statistics to you around that. And it was a survey the German Statistical Institute did with 1,000 people and asked them whether they would like to work from home at the moment and whether they think their employer is technically able to do that, enable that. And actually a surprisingly high share of 75% says, yes, I really want to do that, or maybe not so surprising. But also nearly half, or 45% to be exact, said, I'm not so sure my employer is really able to do that. So there's this gap that we see at the moment where we have been leapfrogging to remote work in the knowledge-based professions, at least. Between technical and I would say also social meta skill ability around the future of work and remote work, where we are sort of now practicing this disruptive future together. And I'd just like to leave two main messages from what the studies on future of work say around what's critical to make it happen successfully. And the first point is the role of leadership, where studies have shown that actually the attitude of leadership, not so much the tech skills as such, but more the attitude, is critical to make it work successfully, not just to implement it, but really have benefits from it. So when we look at how work is traditionally organized, it's often still organized around a traditional principle of control, guiding, specifying, and people then working through different tasks and hierarchical idea of leadership. While in the remote work paradigm, you could say, this is just plain not possible, and that's also always the biggest fear when people implement that for the first time. They don't know what people are really doing. Well, actually, in fact, the studies show that people tend to work more, which is also a problem, but whatever. So the role of leadership for any of you who are also in this position to embrace that change and embody a kind of new work literacy, and I'd say a few words more about what I mean with that in a sec, is quite critical. So for all of you who are in a role of making that happen at the moment, please think about that and do what you can to jump to that sort of coaching role that's implied with new work paradigms, focus on the social skills less than on the tech and so on. And then the second lever that I'd like to highlight for now is related a lot, but affects everyone, whether in a leadership position or not. It comes from that study that I've also thrown in the Atelier folder around documents. And that's around the very simple but very critical understanding that it's not the technology that's most important for remote work and virtual collaboration to work. It's a cultural aspect. It's around how we work together and not so much about with which tools. Though tools, of course, are critical and you need them. And we all know now that so many people have jumped on the virtual cooperation in the last 2 weeks. But it's really the culture. So to keep that question in the foreground when we are pushing for solutions around this is, I think, the key aspect to really make it work. And then we can all navigate, as we will have to do here, around tech glitches and maybe stuff that's problematic, as long as we keep that cultural cooperation spirit and mindset in the forefront. So I've also thrown together some top tips just to mention those quickly, and I think we can go into detail later and when we have the working groups. But that's really all about this cultural aspect. So I hope we can also do it here in the hackathon, that we create these connection points, which are already there in the atelier, where we can also connect over chat in the virtual water cooler. And then otherwise, I think I can relate back for the second 2 points to what Mark said about the key principle of how we want to work together here, about the being kind. And that might be a good guiding principle in life, especially at the moment, if not generally, I think generally, but especially here now. So to reach out a bit more than you usually would, I found a very helpful rule of thumb. And also think about what medium to use when. So if there's tension, something seems off, it's more one-on-one conversation than something big in a big stream. And also the principle to maybe pay it forward, say I help everyone else, even if I don't know what I'll get back, to make it very easy to reach out via channels where you could ask for help, and that kind of thing are usually tips around that culture that tend to make it work better. So to try to summarize, I've tried to give you a bit of the bigger context, just touching very lightly on the whole future of work debate that has been dominated by the AI and automation prospects, but where you can see the scenarios now also being very relevant to the current situation, where we are seeing that in all assumptions around future of work, even if they come from different backgrounds and different views of what the future maybe should be like, It's clear that we are directed towards a future where this kind of new work, remote work, and home office, just as one example of a third place that's being used a lot at the moment, was going anyways to increase a lot and probably be the new status quo over the mid and long term. Socially, just to have it said again very lightly, there's a strong connection to questions of inequality, new social systems, redistribution of resources, and so on. And I think the current situation where we are, it has sort of created a leapfrog to home office, remote work, where many are maybe unprepared, but with a good leadership and community spirit, I think it is implementably rather easily. To be careful, rather, not super easy, of course, when we keep that culture over technology mindset with us. And I hope that this hackathon and all of us working together here can actually contribute to implementing successful virtual work more widely, and ideally really create solutions that can be shared a lot beyond this community. So to make it possible that we are contributing to a successful pathway of dealing with the problems at the moment. Yeah, and with that said, there's more materials, as I said, I've shared around this. With that, I would for now stop. And thank you for your attention. And I'm very curious to see what will happen in the discussion and the problem solving and idea development now. Thanks a lot.